And so I think the relationship that people in the Celtic world, particularly with the Anglo-Celtic Isles, have with this time of year is the moment they see the sun, it makes you want to rip your clothes off, get naked, and dance around a fire, which is kind of what they did. So let's talk about it. Hello, my name is Jacob Todson, and welcome back to the Wisdom of Odin. Today is the first day of spring, which means a lot of you are probably wondering who the old gods of spring are. Or at the very least, I hope you're wondering that, because this time of year is so magical. And so that's why I'm making today's video discussing the old gods of spring, so that you may have a deeper connection this time of year. And so that's also why I'm in this flower bed, and hopefully this also shows you that I don't take myself too seriously. I really don't try to focus too much on the scholarly information of what we know, even though we have to sometimes. I like to focus on the world we live in now and how we can connect in our modern world through a lens very similar to the ancients who came before us. So if all this sounds interesting to you and you appreciate the fact that I do weird things like this, think about supporting this channel on Patreon. It truly helps so very much, and it allows me to continue to be creative and weird and share with you this information about the ancient world. So with that, let's go ahead and begin this conversation discussing the old gods of spring. We're going to begin this conversation talking about the Norse and the Germanic deities that may be associated with springtime. Now, this becomes a little difficult as we're going to discuss going forward in this conversation because the Northern Europeans don't really seem to have a concrete understanding of spring, much like we do today, in the sense that the spring equinox is associated with the solar calendar. And in the ancient past, the lunar calendar was used by the Celtic, Germanic, and Scandinavian, and most of Northern Europe. And I think a lot of it just has to do with logistics. The people of Northern Europe were much further away from the sun as an associative element when it comes to telling time, as compared to like the Middle East or the Mediterranean, where the solar calendars are more prominent and where our solar calendar comes from today. And so the name you may know coming into this video, especially for people who are already into these spiritual and pagan paths, is the name Ostara. Now, Ostara, while is a name that most people know because it's a part of a lot of wheels of the year, I think it's even part of like the Wiccan wheel of the year, it's part of like a lot of different pagan groups celebrate Ostara and the deity Ostara. And this is because there is one account by a Christian scholar that records that a celebration of Ostara took place in the Anglo-Saxon lands, or Eostre. And then, of course, the obvious connection to the name of Easter, which is very similar. That is kind of the information we know. I know Jacob Grimm did some research on it as well, and a lot of the information in general comes from etymology. Now, this is where I lack. Clearly, I don't pronounce things 100% correctly, and actually understanding etymology is one of those things that kind of put me to sleep. And I'm not saying this to discount anyone that enjoys etymology as a research. It becomes very dry, and it becomes very far away from the pagan origin of a lot of the things that we're talking about here. But when it comes to the names such as Ostara, we're really only left with the name and one account. And so this isn't a lot to build any kind of identity. However, a lot of people choose to look at the combination of Easter and Ostara and make the connection that a lot of the traditions that are still done today when it comes to Easter celebrations is, you look at the Easter celebrations of like the bunny rabbit, of hiding eggs, of, you know, painting eggs and candy and feast. And all of a sudden you start looking at it in the stories in the context of Christianity and Jesus and realize there's a huge disconnection between the story of Jesus on the cross and resurrecting after 3 days and the story of Easter and the bunny. And so if you remove Jesus from the cross and look at it simply as a pagan celebration, I think you're left with a lot of information to go off of, in the sense that Ostara may have been attested to bunny rabbits, new life, flowers, harvest, you know, like feast and things like that. Now, to kind of return a little bit back to the idea of lunar and solar calendars and that kind of clash, is when we look at the most important festivals to the ancient Norse and even to the Celtic to some extent, really you just have the two major seasons. You have the celebration of Midsummer in Scandinavia and the Germanic countries, and the celebration of Yule. And these are the two main festivals roughly 6 months apart from each other, celebrating the extreme height of the sun and the extreme depth of the sun, and then its return and that cycle. So there is an observation of the solar in that way, but we really don't have a lot of information to go on those middle points of the sun reaching its middle point in the sky. Now, besides Ostara, there really isn't any solid deity that you can say this is a spring god or goddess. And so when it comes to the Germanic and the Nordic world, I definitely think we've entered the phase of having to draw conclusions. And I would say if there was a spring deity that was celebrated, it would be associated with fertility, it would be associated with farming, it would be associated with flowers, new life. And so when we look at that kind of category, we look at deities such as Freyr and Freya, who are both fertility deities tied to the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine, something we're going to talk about more when it comes to the Celtic. And then, we look at deities such as Sif or Idun, who are tied to, wheat when it comes to Sif, or Idun and the apples and eternal youth. And so, or eternal health as well. And so we can kind of look at that and say, maybe they would have been venerated during this time of year. It's hard to say. One big thing that I think we kind of miss out on a lot, especially as Americans looking into this content and this research today, is we lose a lot of the real world applications of understanding these celebrations and these gods. I remember when I was living in Germany during this time of year and seeing the different flowers that are associated with it, I had a deep connection to this plant called Waldmeister, which is a plant that comes out in May and that is brewed into a traditional drink that has slight hallucinogenic effects and would have been tied to spring and summer celebrations, going out, dancing, having bonfires, because it kind of makes you a little, whimsical, let's just say. There's a lot of hidden context clues to what might have happened in the past, but it's just hard to say definitively who the gods of spring were when it came to the Germanic and Nordic world, but hopefully this gave you a place to start when it comes to those regions of the world and what they believed in the ancient past. But next, we're going to talk about the Celtic world.
A big part of the problem is humans seeing themselves as separate from nature. Now, ecology, the word ecology means the study of home. Eco is home. You are part of the ecosystem. And again, when you are in the landscape practicing survival skills, that becomes more obvious. So if you're just going out on day hikes with your modern equipment, bringing all the food with you and then going back home, that's one thing, but then you're going out with this very simple equipment and actually getting all your food from the environment, fishing, hunting, getting wild edibles. You see yourself as part of the food chain.
I think this quote from Billy Connolly kind of really summarizes the relationship people in the Anglo-Celtic Isles have with the sun and this time of year, summer or spring, is since of the location of the Isles, it actually doesn't get that cold here in the sense that there's not a lot of snow. And so a lot of winter is gray, wet, and cold. And a lot of spring is gray, wet, and cold, and a lot of fall is gray, wet, and cold. And so that kind of leaves you with summer, which sometimes is warm. And so I think the relationship that people in the Celtic world, particularly with the Anglo-Celtic Isles, have with this time of year is the moment they see the sun, it makes you want to rip your clothes off, get naked, and dance around a fire, which is kind of what they did. So let's talk about it. So the best surviving element of an old god of spring comes in the form of Bridget or Brige, as she survives in Saint Bridget in Ireland, the patron saint of Ireland. So Bridget was a figure goddess of the ancient Irish world that was preserved by the Druids at the time of conversion. And so a lot of the traditions that happen around Bridget, Saint Bridget on Saint Bridget's Day on February 1st-ish, are very similar to what the pagans would have done. In fact, if you looked at the celebration of someone celebrating Saint Bridget versus someone celebrating Imbolc, they're very similar, and they're held on the same exact day. The thing that to note here is that Imbolc doesn't happen on March 21st at the spring equinox. It happens way back on February 1st, a time many of us don't associate with spring. This brings an important conversation when it comes to how people recognize spring or summer in the ancient past. It wasn't with the sun, it was with the plants. So the time of Imbolc doesn't happen according to the sun, it happens when it comes to the plants. And so the snowdrop flower and I believe the dandelion both begin to come out this time of year. And so people in the ancient past would have witnessed this, they would have seen the first flowers and known that this is the time of Bridget. And so this was the time to celebrate the coming of new life because the first flowers are out, despite the weather probably still being absolutely disgusting. Now Beltane is probably what you could argue is the first day of spring/summer to the Celtic world. And as always, as a quick break to remind you, the Celtic world is a massive place that we mostly base on our knowledge of the Irish world and the Anglo-Celtic Isles in the sense of like Wales, England, and Scotland. So our information about the Celtic is very widespread, but also very isolated. So just as your friendly reminder when talking about all of the Celtic traditions, we're mostly talking about the Celtic traditions that come from the Irish. So in the terms of Beltane, it's celebrated quite widely because Beltane is also a part of the Wiccan Wheel of the Year. But the way that Beltane is celebrated now is not how Beltane was celebrated in the past. Yes, there's fire. Yes, there's dancing, probably alcohol, and people frolicking into the woods to do spring type things. But when it comes to the celebration of the past, it was around a deity called Beel or Belinus, I believe, as we don't know that much about this deity anymore. And what has taken its place is the celebration of the Green Man and the May Queen, which is very common on a lot of Beltane celebrations. This is also a good time to tell you that I'm going to Ireland to witness a Bealtaine celebration, their version of Beltane, here in a couple of months. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel because I will be posting that festival. I've been given permission to film at that festival to show you a traditional Irish pagan celebration of Bealtaine. And I'm very excited to show it to you. And I'm going to be filming a lot of Irish content. So definitely make sure you're subscribed for that. It's coming up and it's going to be truly incredible. So where did the Green Man and the May Queen come from? A lot of different places. So the Green Man is very old. We actually have information about the first Green Man face shown all the way in Iraq. And it's kind of traveled up into the Mediterranean and then eventually up into here. So the Green Man as an identity has been around for a very long time. But the Green Man as it's taken place in Beltane and modern pagan traditions definitely associates itself with, the return of nature, with greenery, but also it's kind of mixed with the Wiccan idea of the Lord and the Lady or the horned god. And so the horned god is a kind of a conglomeration of a lot of different pagan male deities, kind of centered around, the animals, the wild, but also fertility and agriculture, and really just in general, a lot of masculine features are put into the Green Man. So who the Green Man was when it started in Iraq or wherever and started moving its way all the way up into Northern Europe, it's very different than the Green Man we're left with now. And the same can be said for the May Queen. From what I can understand, the May Queen is actually from the May Day celebrations of Christian belief, and it's like a young woman who is selected to be the May Queen in a parade or a festival. And then this kind of mixed with the Wiccan idea of the Lord and the Lady again, and then mixed with the identity of the sun. And the sun's relationship with the greenery of the earth that creates fertility is how I kind of understood this all came together. So each one of these things has a multitude of factors influencing their identities. But this doesn't change the fact that even though the identity of the Green Man and the May Queen when it comes to Beltane today might be more modern than most people realize, it doesn't change the fact that it's connecting to people because you still have the idea of the greenery of the earth, the identity of this, our home, and the identity of the sun's relationship to that and how their union creates abundance and fertility. Now this next bit I don't have a lot of information on, which is why I'm going to allow my new podcasting partner, Kubi, to share with you about the goddess Andraste and her thoughts on it when it comes to the story of Boudica. And so this comes from the first episode of the Tree of Life podcast I'm doing with my good friend Kubi May, so I'm going to allow her to describe to you her idea about Andraste in connection to spring.
I was researching, are there any goddesses that are connected with hares? Because we think of Ostara, the connection with the hares and the eggs. And we've got Andraste, which is an interesting goddess that was evoked by Boudica on the battlefield against the Romans. She kind of cried out to Andraste for victory against the Romans. So she's a goddess of victory, but also fertility, which is interesting. And in that battle cry, she released Boudica, she released a hair from out underneath her skirt as a divination tool, and whichever way the rabbit ran would divine whether they were going to win or lose against the Romans. So that's so interesting. I'm like, here again, we've got this idea of a fertility goddess that's also connected with battle and victory. And that's really, it got me thinking maybe there is something about the charge of life force at this point in time, like spring kind of being like the urging of the victory of the land. as the sap rises up into the plants and, back into the world.
Now I'm sure you're wondering to this point is, Jacob, what about Stonehenge? Everyone wants to know about Stonehenge. Don't they have celebrations of the equinox there? Yes and no. So, from what I can tell, Stonehenge was primarily used as an observation point of the winter and summer solstices. Now, there are alignments with the equinoxes, but it seems like most scholars agree that the winter and summer solstices were the primary focus of Stonehenge. And the reason for this, I think, is because, again, when we look at the ancient times, the ancient past, the solstices were much more recognizable than the equinoxes. I'm not saying they didn't know that the equinoxes existed. It's just like, if we didn't have any names for the equinoxes, we might not actually even recognize them. They more than likely recognize the extreme points of the sun, because the summer solstice, when the sun is at its highest, when the days are at its longest, and then observing when the days are at their shortest and the darkest, and the dying of the sun, and then the return of the sun. This is what they were witnessing. And so I just think that at that time, people didn't celebrate as much the middle point of, hey, we almost made it. They wanted to celebrate we made it to the point that the sun has returned. It's reached its height. Like, those are much more expressive moments in life than the middle point, than we're halfway there and living on a prayer. I hate myself. Now, this doesn't mean I don't have something to talk about here, because it does seem to me that in the Celtic world that we're talking about here, the Norse world, the identity of the sun as a god began to fade away. This is something I'm going to be talking about more, because I think it's something that a lot of people don't know about and haven't really looked into. And it's the fact that the sun cults of the Bronze Age seem to have disappeared into the Iron Age. When we got closer to Christianity, the identity of the sun as a god seemed to fade away, because the people of the Bronze Age and prior, they recognized and venerated the sun. They tried to understand the sun, and so did the people of the Bronze Age in Scandinavia and the Celtic world. And then it seemed to have faded away. This recognition as the sun as a divine power seemed to go away. I think if you're looking for any deity to begin any form of veneration or association when it comes to the ancient past, the sun, the earth, and the moon, whatever you want to call them, have been venerated by every society on the planet. When we look at the ancient past, the hunter-gatherers into the agricultural farmers, these were the elements that they tied to the most. It's the thing we see every day and every night, and the thing we live on. Of course, they're going to associate and deify these things. And so I think if you're looking for an old god of spring, they're already still here. They're the same things that our ancient ancestors were worshiping 10,000, 12,000, 30,000 years ago, we can still worship now. And I think that's a powerful thing. You're just going to change the names of what you're worshiping. But regardless of what you call the gods of this time of year, how do you connect more with it? And I think the answer is quite simple. Look at the elements of spring, like the flowers I see over here, the tree I'm sitting in, the sun I'm looking at. Bring these elements more into your daily life. Decorate your house in flowers. Open the windows. Let it air out. Spring cleaning is a thing for a reason. I think it's all becoming to this ancient understanding of our relationship to the ancient world. Go outside when you see the sun. Celebrate the new life of spring. Dance, sing, become expressive. Look to Beltane in the fire festivals. All it was a time to get together with your community and release yourself from the hibernation of winter, to strip your clothes off and run naked among the friends and family. It might be a little weird these days during your Easter dinner. Maybe don't do that. But truly, this time of year, the more I've gotten into these paths, the more it makes me just want to express myself. And I think because of our 9-to-5 culture that we're built around, we think that every day should be the same. Every season should be the same, and this is just incorrect. I'm a nearly 30-year-old man in a tree talking about ancient gods and getting naked and running around. Be a little weird this time of year, truly. All the amazing people that support me are right here. Some more videos over here, and on my face is the subscribe button. I'll see you in the next video here at the Wisdom of Odin.